Thanks, Brandon, and thanks for everyone at ThoughtWorks and Meetup.ai who made it possible for this event. And also, thanks for everyone for coming. And I know that this is probably not the ideal format for a meeting, but on the bright side, I'm glad that we get to have a conversation across geographic boundaries. So please do feel free to take advantage of the opportunity to ask questions to the Slido, and we'll be looking forward to having a stimulating conversation after the talk. So as Brendan mentioned, my name is Justin Shenk, and I'm CTO and co-founder of VisioLab, and I'll be talking today about learning with limited label data for computer vision, specifically deep learning and computer vision being the focus. And we'll jump right into it. So why do I think that I'm qualified to speak about this? So my background is computer vision and machine learning. I started out in neuroscience research in the US and was trying to understand the brain and how the brain works. Like everyday things like speaking and talking, it's really complex and hard to understand. And so actually it was too hard for me. I switched to something much simpler like machine learning. And from that point, I got really excited about the research that was going on in Germany. I did a master's in cognitive science focused on machine learning and computer vision. I've been practicing my German ever since, but it has only barely improved. Please try me on that sometime. I've worked with Intel building deep learning applications. So I built a face recognition application for them built on FaceNet, which I demoed at CVPR, NIPS, and ICML. Also, I've been really active with open source software, so you can, I encourage you to check out Delve or Traja if you want to find some local open source projects that are going on. These are deep learning libraries for, Delve is for looking into the neural networks and how they train and trying to understand how they work. And Traja is a trajectory analysis library for time series data. I'm also a mentor for Google Summer of Code for OpenCV. The past couple of years, I focus on Python and video deep learning applications. I worked in Stockholm at a company called Peltarion as an ML research engineer and data scientist, and am completing a PhD at Radboud University in Netherlands. And that brings me to today. So we are now here because we're interested in, or we think we might be interested in the topic of deep learning and limited label data. So I'll tell you why I think the kind of problems that VisioLab is looking at is also relevant to the wider community who's interested in understanding these problems. So our setting for this talk will be in a canteen, a cafeteria, if you're American. The canteen that we're thinking of is one where you're able to check out food and you want to basically get the food onto your tray and to get to your table as fast as you can, so you can get to enjoying it. The thing that's limiting you from getting there is that right now we depend on having like physical eyes to recognize the food that you're purchasing, so that way you can be efficiently checked out. And VisioLab is building an iPad-based checkout that recognizes the food on your tray so that you can simply present your food, tap your card and pay, and then go to your seat. So in this case, we're using the camera from the iPad and our UI on the iPad. So it turns out that the same kind of technology that you would use for recognizing food on a tray is also quite useful if you're going to recognize food at your home or at a restaurant. So the same technology that we're building for object detection and food detection is also useful for applications. We want to recognize, for example, what is the nutritional content of this food? Or we want to recognize, hey, what would be a recipe for making this food so I can make this same food at home? This is the direction that our technology is moving, and we're really interested in understanding what kinds of problems we can solve with this approach. So roughly it's called AI on the edge, and this is a direction that's really important for us. But let's go back to the main task, automated food checkout. So it sounds like a pretty straightforward thing. You've got food on a tray and you want to recognize it. Nowadays, you can do a lot of stuff out of the box with object detectors like YOLO. you might have heard of. We're going to find out why that's challenging, like why that's really challenging in this neighborhood of problems, and what is it that you can do to improve your situation if you find that you have very limited data. So a quick overview of how this use case looks. So the use case is putting the food on the tray and being recognized, and then tapping your card. And this is actually an older version of our prototype before we switched to the iPad. And this is a Canteen in Osnabrück, Germany. So that's what our customers are expecting to do. All of this, the whole machine learning process starts with data, and data is super crucial. Getting enough data and enough clean quality data is the key that'll let you build the technology around it. It's more so important in deep learning, as you may know, than it is in other fields, where say with statistics, it's the power of your understanding of what you can do with the relationship between the data attributes and variables. And deep learning specifically, the burden is shifted to the quality of the data and your ability to test out a lot of different things with that data. So here's a quick video from the early days of VisioLab, where our CEO actually was labeling data of fake food. And this is how we collected data in the beginning stages to generate a large data set. So as you can imagine, it's kind of tedious work to put food on trays and take pictures of it over and over again, but this is how we started. This amount of data that you can collect, if you can imagine, is probably not going to be billions of images of data, so it's not Google level data, but you'll see that there's quite a bit you can do with it. So in that case, we were running using a Jetson Nano, and then today we switched to an iPad tablet. So this main question comes up: how much data do I need? So to share a personal anecdote, I recently was asked by a researcher at Charité University in Berlin, I want to build an AI that can recognize tumors in the eye just based on some images of the data. I want to build an app, and that app's going to let doctors share images of a tumor in the eye and to recognize automatically what it is. How much data do I need in this case? And the answer is, it depends. So it always depends how much data you need, depending on several factors, like complexity of the case itself, also how well this problem has been studied. But we can start with some rough estimates. So I suggested at least start with 1,000 if you can. So, but you don't always have 1,000 images. So let's consider cases. So like for most average problems that you want to do deep learning with, it's good to have 10,000 to 100,000 examples. For example, if you want to recognize facial expressions from images, it helps if you have no other data, then start with tens of thousands of images of different facial expressions, and then you can build a reliable facial expression recognition. And part of the reason is because you have so much variance between how different people look. So if you have a smile on one person and a smile on another person, the smile may look quite similar, but if the rest of the facial features are not similar, then that's kind of a confounding variable for the algorithm. And then when you get to even more complex problems like machine translation, or you want to generate high dimensional data, something that requires deep learning, like these cases, you need even more data. So text, and if you've seen the GPT-3 results, super impressive that you can take text data and you can guess some information based on limited text inputs. You can predict the next word. Super interesting and impressive. And this is possible because of the large amount of data that was collected. And again, a good heuristic is the more dimensions your data has, then the more data you need. So if you're, for example, in the facial expression situation, if you can fit your images into 48 by 48 pixels and it's still recognizable by a person, that's probably a good sign that you maybe don't need more than 48 by 48 by 10 data points, examples of data. So generally, more generally, the more complex the problem, the more data you need. So returning to our use case where, for example, the chef in a canteen had made a new dish just for that day, and they want to share, they want to be able to, the system to be able to recognize that dish, even though it's never been seen before by the system. So you may have showed it before spaghetti bolognese, you may have showed it pizza, but it's never seen this casserole du jour that you make for this one day. And so how is it supposed to recognize this item? And the general question is, how many images do you need to recognize it? Well, there's a way of referring to that. This is another good example that's maybe more relevant to everyday experience. How can you recognize a face again after only having seen it once? So it's bridging the question in the cognitive sciences of how is it that people are able to recognize someone after seeing them once? Or if you've only heard a word once, a child can hear a word one time from its mother or father or from someone around and be able to recognize that word again as a distinct word. It's really amazing. So from the cognitive science point of view, it says something about how amazing our minds are, and also how language is really like something that we're so good at differentiating between. But it is also true for visual data as well. And this question applied to machine learning then gets referred to as few-shot learning. And in the literature, the difference between k-shots, one-shot, zero shots is the difference between how many different items do you need to recognize, how many reference images do you need to recognize a general category of items. So where, for example, we say, okay, maybe I have to see a person 5 times in my life before I can always recognize them, like in any context. Okay, that would be quite a bit. But if you say I can, after seeing them only 1 time, I can recognize this person in any context. Okay, cool. But then what would zero shot be? So zero shot means that it's never seen this person before, but it recognizes that it's a distinct person. So in the case of the food, okay, here's a new item that I've never seen before, and I can tell that it's distinct from all of the things that you showed before. So that's an even more ambitious goal than recognizing with only 1 image. Generally, we can think about like, what's the context for making a decision? So if for example, you have showed to a machine learning algorithm, to a deep learning algorithm, 3 different images, 3 different types of images, excuse me. Like a polar bear, a baseball bat, and a basketball. And then you show it another picture of a basketball. So we wanted to recognize the basketball as one of the classes that it's seen before. But the one way to do that is to make sure that you train by teaching it to learn that items from similar classes are the same thing and items from different classes are different. And it seems like a very general thing to teach, quote unquote, to teach an algorithm similarity between things, but this is actually a really powerful way of identifying patterns that are not explicitly mentioned to the machine. So a main tool for this that's also useful, other than the neural networks, which we'll get into in a little bit, is data augmentation. So you can go from that 1 shot, 1 image data set to 100 images or 1,000 or more by doing object detection with synthetic data. Excuse me, my voice is a bit verklempt today. So the idea would be to generate lots of images. There was a great Medium post by Neuralabs recently, and they're superimposing food over lots of different backgrounds. This is also quite similar to what you can do out of the box with, say, Turing Create, which is the Apple's the iOS Core ML model trainer. If you throw in there, say, hey, I'd like to train an object detector on my iPad and you send it an image, it will superimpose the image over some 5,000 background images, which makes it really useful for detecting things in the wild. And that's what generally object detectors are used for when they're open source. Mostly it's interesting when you can detect things in the wild. So that's really cool. And actually we've been working on similar approaches. So this is from last year, and the approach allows us to do resizing, rotating. This is all different food items superimposed on backgrounds of trays. We can do shearing, intersection, and blurring. Each of these augmentation strategies gives you potentially more data which you can use to train your model. And what's important is that it can recognize that food item in different contexts. So for example, if you have different trays, you want to make sure that the food is recognizable on different trays and those different backgrounds. I'm going to show some results from a thesis from Alexis Dracopoulos, who did his master's thesis with us at VisioLab. He was a computational mathematics master's student at University of Edinburgh, and he applied few-shot learning and metric learning application. He applied a few different experiments to the food data sets and came up with some quite interesting results. So this is quite specific to his research, but hopefully if you have enough background, it should grab your attention. And if it's new for you, then hopefully it's something for asking questions later. So he did compare a couple approaches. So triplet loss, Siamese nets, so whether or not you're using 3 or 2 different images and comparing, like we showed in the previous example, when you're comparing 2 different items, like that's typically the Siamese net, or if you're using 3 different ones, you can use a triplet loss. And so different architectures, but also different unsupervised methods. And we'll mention why that's important. So the one part is to learn the relationship between the data, like how similar are these different data, and then the other part is to classify the data. So okay, cool, we've learned that these are similar, but like we don't know exactly what class it should be. So like these are somehow separate functions, and I'll briefly mention like how these could be useful. So for example, you could use these unsupervised methods without the fancy architectures. So some results, for example, that you can see here is the more items, the more shots that were images were provided and per class, then the higher the accuracy. And we can see with different data sets, there was different loss functions. Generally, the more data you use, the better the performance. So this is a bit rather technical, but just to show that the deviation was going down as you increase the number of items per class. So roughly how the Siamese networks are working is they are taking input into the network and they're learning this distance function between the different embeddings coming out of the different arms of the Siamese net. And that lets them learn, okay, if these 2 items are supposed to be from the same class, this is like, for example, this is 2 pictures of the same person, then learn to reduce the distance between these 2 embeddings. And so features coming out of a feature extractor are going to be brought closer together if they're from the same class and pushed further apart if they're from different classes. And contrastive loss is another way of referring to this function of like punishing the network if it doesn't recognize how similar or different things are. So generally, we've learned that we've taken the image, the raw image, or we take the image, we push it through the neural network to get some kind of embedding, some kind of feature vector. We've learned the feature vectors that are more similar or more different by this contrastive loss or this metric learning approach. And then we've got these feature vectors now, and we want to visualize them because we want to see how similar they are, like what's the distance between them and what categories do they belong to. And this is one projection that from his thesis that showed that if you color the different colors of the different classes, that there's actually quite good separation between 10 different classes in a food data set, and that the food items were clustered quite well together. So you could expect, for example, if you have two soups that look similarly, that they would be similar in terms of the shape and texture. Maybe you'd have a salad that would be quite far out. So how do you measure the results for these kinds of experiments? Well, we talk about top one accuracy, and we can talk about other types of accuracy. So top one accuracy is the intuitive way to say, is it correct? Did it correctly classify this salad as a salad? And top three accuracy is from the top three predictions that it had is the correct answer in that top three. So your top three accuracy is going to be higher because it's more likely that in the top three guesses that the actual true answer is there. And we're also going to look at KNN and LMNN. These are two unsupervised learning algorithms. So KNN, K nearest neighbors, is looking to find the cluster that's most close to it. So for example, you've got a data point and you want to know which group does this data point belong to. And you can do that by saying, well, all of my neighbors are belonging to salad, so probably I'm a salad too. And then LMNN, largest margin nearest neighbor. So it's the same idea, but it says it wants to punish the parts of the feature vector depending on how far off they are. So it helps you to figure out which of the features in that feature vector are most useful for making the classification. So it gives you more flexibility. And the results that he found was it's pretty clear that as you add more images, then, or when you look at more images, your top three accuracy is going to be higher than your top one accuracy, right? As you add more images, your n-shot increases. Also, your accuracy goes up. That makes sense, right? You're providing 10 different images, you'll get a higher higher accuracy than if you only provide one. And also comparing different types of unsupervised learning algorithms, we could get some results and get an idea, okay, cool, these different approaches make some difference. It's worth checking these out. And you compare these with a typical neural network classifier. So the takeaway here is less about the specifics of the experiment than to ask, like, how could you test this and how could an experiment look? And this is one example of experiment. It's quite useful to see everything in one space because if you're trying to control for a lot of different factors, it's useful to organize the results in this way. So another point to consider, since we talked about some fancy neural network architecture like Siamese nets, we can also talk about GANs, which are equally relevant. So generally, the more data you have, the more you can work with. So why not throw in other information like ingredients and cooking method and taste, cuisine. So if you have more data to work with, you can use that data, and you can even generate images if you have image data to work with. So here are some results from a previous study showing synthetic food image data. So if you look at this and you think, okay, how realistic does this look? I would definitely give credit to the authors of this paper for making stuff that looks like it could be edible. If you extrapolate into the future few years, maybe it's going to be higher resolution and look much, much more realistic. So I think what's exciting to me when I see that someone's generating images of food is not necessarily where it is today, but where I could imagine, wow, in a few years, there's going to be photorealistic, synthetic images of food that has never been created before. And maybe we'll even have new recipes for. That's one of the exciting things about AI at this time. You can only imagine the future. So I will share then the takeaway from from this talk that I think it's worth considering. More data is better. Okay, that's probably not news to most of you, but it improves your ability to recognize things, improves your ability to even generate more synthetic data. Also, there's many different algorithms and tricks that you can use. So deep learning is a black art, you may have heard, and finding people who are skilled with this and actually have wrestled with these types of problems is a really useful way to start, and it's the only way, sane way to start that I know. But there's so much information online, so yeah, don't be shy to learn things and to ask people. And yeah, trying lots of non-parametric methods. So it turns out that if you already have this really cool feature vector, like we showed in the plot with the projections, then you can do a lot to understand how the classifications are working. Is it classifying it as this or that? And you can visualize it very easily. So it turns out that a lot of the old school methods are at least as useful as the new state-of-the-art methods. Cool. So here's some references. Alexis's thesis. If you're interested in reading that, send me an email. I can make sure to send you a copy, and also some links to papers that we referred to. And I'm more than happy to answer your questions. Thanks a lot.